John Perkins grew up in New Hampshire as the son of a teacher at a boys' prep school. In the late 1960s, while trying to avoid the Vietnam War draft, he interviewed with the National Security Agency, NSA, through family connections. Despite admitting to past involvement in a knife fight and opposing the Vietnam War, the NSA was interested in him due to his friendship with an Iranian whose father was a CIA asset. However, Perkins ultimately joined the Peace Corps instead, requesting assignment to the Amazon. Perkins spent 3 years in Ecuador with the Peace Corps, initially tasked with setting up credit and savings cooperatives among indigenous Shuar people. However, this proved impossible as the Shuar operated on a barter system without currency. Perkins struggled to adapt until he became seriously ill and was treated by a local shaman using ayahuasca. This experience profoundly impacted Perkins, introducing him to the concept of touching the jaguar, confronting one's fears and limitations to change perceptions and reality. Near the end of his Peace Corps service, Perkins was recruited by Chas T. Main, a Boston-based consulting firm with ties to U.S. intelligence agencies. He was trained by a woman named Claudine, who offered him money, power, and sex, things the NSA had identified as Perkins's key motivators. His job was to produce economic reports and convince developing countries to take on large loans from institutions like the World Bank to fund major infrastructure projects that would enrich U.S. corporations but ultimately leave the countries in debt. Perkins' role involved identifying countries with resources desired by U.S. corporations, then convincing their leaders to accept huge loans for infrastructure projects. These projects primarily benefited wealthy elites and U.S. companies but left countries indebted. When unable to repay, countries were forced to privatize resources, allow U.S. military bases, or support U.S. policies. Perkins used manipulated economic projections showing GDP growth to sell these deals, though GDP mainly reflected benefits to the wealthy, not average citizens. For several years, Perkins believed he was helping developing countries. However, interactions with leaders like Omar Torrijos of Panama and Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, who refused to cooperate, began to change his perspective. Both leaders later died in suspicious plane crashes. Perkins also dated a Colombian woman whose brother was involved in anti-U.S. movements, further opening his eyes to the negative impacts of his work. After about 7 years, Perkins became increasingly conflicted about his role. During a vacation in the Virgin Islands, he had an epiphany about the exploitative nature of his work and decided to quit. However, leaving proved difficult. He was offered a $500,000 consultant fee by another company to not write a book exposing the economic hitman system. Perkins accepted, but used the money to fund projects supporting indigenous people in the Amazon. Years later, after the 9/11 attacks, Perkins felt compelled to write about his experiences. He wrote his book in secret to avoid interference. Despite initial rejections, the book became a bestseller. Shortly after publication, Perkins experienced a severe health crisis following a suspicious lunch meeting, which some speculated was an assassination attempt. Perkins discusses how China has adopted and modified economic hitman tactics. Unlike the U.S. approach, China claims not to interfere in countries' new internal affairs and asks what projects countries want to invest in rather than dictating terms. China promotes its rapid economic growth and poverty reduction as a model, contrasting it with U.S. economic stagnation for average citizens. Perkins expresses concern about the current state of U.S. global influence, noting that other countries increasingly view the U.S. as unreliable due to policy shifts between administrations. He sees China and Russia as filling the void left by declining U.S. influence. He also discusses the challenges posed by climate change, though the podcast host expresses some skepticism about the severity and political nature of climate change narratives. The conversation touches on how information is controlled in the U.S., with Perkins sharing an anecdote about a New York Times reporter explaining how advertisers and publishers influence what gets published, even without direct censorship. The podcast host relates a story about how the CIA intervened to prevent publication of an article about covert operations in Russia. Perkins presents his theory that humans have alienated themselves from nature through a philosophy that views humans as separate from and superior to nature. He suggests reframing our perspective to see this alienation as the true alien threat, which could unite humanity. He advocates for moving away from an economic system focused on short-term profit maximization, which he calls the death economy, towards a life economy that prioritizes environmental and social well-being. Despite acknowledging the significant challenges facing humanity, Perkins expresses optimism about the potential for positive change. He sees growing awareness worldwide of the need for systemic change as the first step towards creating a more sustainable and equitable global system. He believes humanity is at a crossroads, with one path leading to destruction and the other to a more positive future. The podcast host, while generally receptive to Perkins's ideas, expresses some skepticism about the feasibility of large-scale change and the severity of issues like climate change. He suggests that power dynamics between nation-states and corporate influence on politics may be significant obstacles to the kind of systemic change Perkins envisions. Perkins reflects on his own journey, noting that despite his high income as an economic hitman, he was unhappy and reliant on alcohol and drugs. He contrasts this with his current life, where he has downsized his lifestyle and finds greater satisfaction in working towards positive change.